So previously, on the previous occasion, we were discussing Even Ezer Siman Tezayin. The premise was that we were discussing the Isser of Habal Hagoya, and the specific discussion in the Nesakalim of whether there's an additional Isser of V'davak Be'ishtoi when the Goya is an Eishus Ish to a Goy, whether we recognize the Ishus between a Goya and a Goya. Obviously, there's some concept of the sort with regards to enforcing Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, but does it have any significance at all for a Yid when a Yid is coming in interaction with that? From there, we went off into the tshuva of the Rivash at great length. The Rivash was dealing with this early version of this question of Jews getting married, Shalei Kafi Das Moshe Yisrael, and the Rivash went at great length to argue that it should not count for anything. There certainly should be no chashash of Kiddushin. There's no Kiddushin in the Christian ceremony. There's no Kiddushin in the Yichud that followed due to all of the context that led up to that. There's no reason to think that they were miskaven like Kiddushin. And that was the Rivash's argument. And then we concluded with a bit of a discussion about how the parallels we see to the more contemporary discussions about civil marriage, and how this began as a very earnest discussion about 150 years ago, quoted from the Chalkas Yaakov, we quoted from Rabbi Yisrael Veltz by way of the Chalkas Yaakov, who summarized a bit of the discussion in the decades that preceded post-World War II. We also mentioned the Rogatchover's unique shita, touched on that briefly in the Chalkas Yaakov's, some of the Chalkas Yaakov's response to that. And honestly, we really just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of this huge topic, this huge discussion of civil marriage. Of course, I mentioned in passing that Machon Yerushalayim is Mitzayin to Rav Moshe and to Rav Henkin, but of course, famously for those in the United States, the two big opinions on the matter are usually said to be Rav Henkin and Rav Moshe, and Rav Henkin was of the more unique opinion that civil marriage is cause for concern. There might be a chash kedushin, there might be a need for a get. Rav Moshe was the one who said that that's not the case. So that discussion continued as late and as recently as post-World War II here in the United States. I was told by someone who's involved in Gittin that in fact, were a case of civil marriage to come before a Beis Din, were the couple to come before a Beis Din to ask what to do next, that Batei Din in the United States are Choshesh Lechatchila for the Shita of Rav Henkin, which is very interesting. But there's so much more, and of course the Rogatchover Shita, there's so much more to be explored, and in fact, subsequent to recording that, I came across far more material on this subject in general, both on the topic generally of rabbinic responses to civil marriage, as well as the Rogatchover Shita specifically. So there's a lot of very interesting material, and I think would be kedai to follow up on the previous one and to explore some of what's out there on this topic. So we'll see what we get to, we'll see how much time it takes and what we cover in that amount of time, and we'll be flexible as we go. So the first thing I want to talk about really though is I came across this very interesting and what looks like an important work, Seder Kiddushin V'Nisuin Acharei Chasimas HaTalmud, Mechkar Histori Dogmati Bedine Yisrael Me'es Avraham Chaim Freiman. So this is, I guess we wouldn't call it a sefer per se in the Yeshiva Shalingo, we'd call it a book, but it is a book that is full of halachic mekayros, traditional halachic mekayros and halacha and takanas that relate to Kiddushin V'Nisuin over the generations, and as the title says specifically, Acharei Chasimas HaTalmud. What happened in the 1,000+ years subsequent to the Chasimas HaTalmud? What developments were there? What took place during that time? A very ambitious work. Has somewhere between 350 and 400 pages. I was looking a bit into the author. Who's the author of Ram Chaim Freiman? So he has an entry on Hebrew Wikipedia. He was born in 1899 in Moravia, and he was killed, sadly and unfortunately, in April 1948 in Israel in an event that is known, and this has an English Wikipedia article as well, the Hadassah Medical Convoy Massacre, which itself is a little bit of history that's worth mentioning, giving it a moment. The Hadassah Convoy Massacre took place on April 13th, 1948, when a convoy escorted by Haganah militia, bringing medical and military supplies and personnel to Hadassah Hospital in Mount Scopus, Jerusalem, was ambushed by Arab forces. 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, students, patients, faculty members, and Haganah fighters, and one British soldier were killed in the attack, including 23 women. A very, very, very terrible event for the nascent Jewish state at the time. And Avraham Chaim Freiman was unfortunately one of those killed in this attack. But leading up until then, he died prematurely at the age of 48. But leading up until then, he was a very, very prominent scholar of, they call it Choker HaMishpat HaIvri, so a scholar of the history of traditional Jewish law, halacha, but within a certain context of its applicability to Israeli law, perhaps today. It's even referred to as Mishpat Ivri in English, a famous category in scholarship. So he was a leading scholar in that field, and this work, Seder Kiddushin B'Nisuin, fits in to that interest, to that focus. I'll just note that he's also known for having published a lot of material relating to the Rambam. He published an edition of the Tshuvas of the Rambam, including a number of Tshuvas that were printed for the first time from manuscript. He printed the Tshuvas of Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, and he's a name that you come across in Svarim. I know in Likutei Sichos, occasionally you'll see Tshuvas HaRambam Freiman, Tshuvas of Avraham ben Rambam Freiman. It's a name I've seen around, and I never stopped to actually ask myself, who was this Freiman, whose edition of the Tshuvas we're citing? So it's this very same Avraham Chaim Freiman. So it's a name that's perhaps, if you pay attention to tziyunim, to references, you might have noticed his name and at least seen the name. At any rate, this particular work on Kiddushin B'Nisuin was published in Tafshin Hey, 1945, shortly before his premature death, and it looks to be a very thorough, comprehensive, groundbreaking work, especially for its time. In his own introduction, in his Akdama, he states that Jewish scholarship at the time, tended to focus on the Talmudic era, and there wasn't anything discussed, the development of halacha, where halacha went, where Jewish practice went in the centuries subsequent to the Talmud. He emphasizes that he dug very deep into the Sifrei HaPsakim, the Sifrei HaTshuvas, to get a bit of the theory, which you can call it perhaps, but he also focuses a lot on takanas and haskamas. There's so much documentation on particular takanas that Kehilas had, and that tells you a lot about what was going on the ground and how Jewish communities responded to that. He points out that looking at this topic, you really see how the Jewish world was very, very, very much splintered as the centuries went on, and different communities and different cultures went in very different directions in terms of how they shaped the way things like marriage worked, and even the halacha how the halachas of marriage were applied. He also notes that there's the phenomenon that in today's lingo might be called Ashka-centrism, or if I'm saying it correctly, the idea that the Ashkenazim tend to get the center stage at the expense of others. And he says that that is very much the case in this Tchum of Halacha as well. There's so much rich material from the Sfardim and from the Arabian Jews that certainly unknown to the Ashkenazim, and yet, if in a certain sense, the Jews in the Ottoman Empire had more autonomy. They had more power and control over how they governed themselves, and there could be a lot of interesting material there, which he is seeking to emphasize equally along with the Ashkenazi Mekairis. He then divides his work into 4 sections, 4 tkufas. The first tkufa from the Go'ainim till Girish Sfarad, and divided by geography. Tkufa Shniya, the second tkufa, is from Girish Sfarad till the Gzeres Tach. The third tkufa from Gzeres Tach until Jews lost their autonomy. And the fourth tkufa is Jews having lost that autonomy. Right? So as we know, Dafka in the last 200 years or so, as various states started to modernize or started to assume the form that's more reminiscent of what a state is like today, Jews tended to lose the ability for the Kehillah to run its own show, and Jews were expected to come in line with the common law, the law of the land. And this applies to different countries in different ways, so that is its own fourth category. And the topic that we are coming from here, the topic that we're interested in at the moment, is one that belongs to that fourth category, secular law, secular marriage being introduced, and Jews having to contend with that. That is a product of the Jewish Kehillah no longer controlling the marriage of Jews within the community, even if Jews identified with the community, and this option of just showing up and getting married through the court, getting married through a government clerk, etc. But before I get to the section of his work that focuses on the topic that we're coming from, I do want to take a look at his own summaries. He provides summaries at the end of each chapter of each tkufa about what we can say transpired and developed during that time. And there's some really fascinating material just within those summaries to just give you a general big picture sense of the history of Kiddushin and Nisuin in Halacha and in Yiddishkeit. Very, very interesting material. So let's start with his first period, Tkufas HaRishayim. So right away, there's this very, very interesting point. Everyone who learns Gemara knows that Kiddushin and Nisuin are two separate things. They take place on two separate occasions. The Kiddushin is the engagement, but it's not engagement as we know it today. It's not Shidduchin. Kiddushin meant that they have a zika, they have this connection of Baal ve'ishtoi, she's an Ashes Ish, very much so in terms of Chiyuv Misa, etc. And that was the original form of engagement in Yiddishkeit, and it sounds like from Tanakh as well. And obviously we know we don't do that anymore. We know that the Kiddushin and Nisuin happen under the chuppah at the wedding in one shot, and we know that there's a shidduch instead. The shidduch takes place a few months earlier, and the shidduch is considered somewhat binding, but you could break a shidduch, at least as we know it today. So where does this come from? When did this happen? Often I've heard this question. People express and wonder, where exactly did this change take place? So this is the first thing that's discussed here. And he says that if we were to summarize this period of time, there's some major changes and differences in the Seder of Kiddushin and Nisuin. And the major one being that these minhagim in different lands brought the Erusin and Nisuin together, the Kiddushin and the Chuppah, and turned them into one ceremony with just a small interruption. He says this really was developed in France and in Germany towards the end of the days of Rashi, so it's around the time of Rashi. I remember discussing this in the past about whether there's a makar in Rashi for this way or for that way. Maybe you still see both in Rashi. So this rings a bell, even without looking at the makaris as he brings them. He says this was at the end of Rashi, apparently right after the Gzeiras Tatnu, the Crusades of 1098, and in the nearby European lands, Provence, North Italy, most of Spain, it spread throughout the 1100s. And then, of course, Erusin is replaced instead by Shidduchin. So Shidduchin was essentially invented in these lands, and Shidduchin was given power. Now Shidduchin, he calls it has Zikas Momoin instead of Zikas Ha'ishos. Kiddushin bound the future husband and wife to be with a Zika of Ishos, which is a lot more severe and can cause problems if something goes wrong in the interim. So instead you have Shidduchin, and Shidduchin are powered by a Zikas Momoin, so both parties stand to lose. There's some financial, some money on the line at risk if you break the shidduch. That was originally, there was a knas, etc. However, he says, there was still a bit of a continuation of the practice of Kiddushin without the chuppah, like you see in Chazal, where any two people are having a conversation and it ends in Kiddushin. So it was still considered legitimate when the Kiddushin were done through a shliach, or, since child marriage was still a thing, by the father of the Ketana accepting the Kiddushin. He says, however, even in those instances, there became a new minhag. There were Kiddushin Shniyim. They would do Kiddushin a second time during the Nisuin, So that way, because at that point is part of the chuppah. You don't just like today. No one would ever consider skipping the harayat mekudeshesli at the beginning of the chuppah. So it had become so accepted and so entrenched that even if they were still following the version of Kiddushin from the Gemara, mekadosh yedei shliach, mekadosh through the father, they would do a second Kiddushin at the chuppah. However, this is only a certain part of Europe, and once you go south or more east, so South Italy and North Africa and Eretz Yisrael and the Arabian lands, they were still doing real Kiddushin at this time. However, he says, there were still a lot of problems, and there are certain problems with Kiddushin that you might be familiar with even from more recent Shalos HaTshuvos, right? You have a bunch of youths are hanging out, and boys are hanging out with girls, and then someone gets to talking, and they decide to make a joke, and the boy gives the girl a ring, or gives her something of value, and they say, haha, harayat mekudeshesli, and all of a sudden you have this major shaila on your hands as to what to do now. Is this for real? Is this serious? What are we going to do? So this is actually, and I'm sure he tracks it throughout the generations up until even much more recently, but problems like this and related problems where abuse and taking advantage of the power of Kiddushin, which can still strictly, technically be done at any moment between any man and woman, these problems were major problems back then at the time, and you could do a Kiddushin and disappear and then go figure out what to do next. So all the varieties of this type of problem were an issue at the time, and that's why you start seeing takanas and askamas from Goinim and Rishayim and all kinds of different geographic locations and different responses to this problem. And these problems are also the reasons for so many details of how we've come to recognize how a Kiddushin and a chuppah are conducted today. So, for example, one of the first thing he lists is that there was a takana that the chuppah, the Kiddushin, should take place in front of 10 people. In fact, I believe we noticed it in the Rivash. Rivash threw in something about the Nisuin b'fnei Asar. He didn't do the Kiddushin in front of 2. He didn't do the Nisuin in front of Asar or something like that. So where did this Asara come from? There's this takana from the Goinim, and then again in Spain, in Talmud Rosh and other places, they said that it has to take place in front of 10 people. That makes it a lot more serious and ensures that if you're at least nominally adhering to the rules, no illicit Kiddushin will be taking place when you see that clearly people have not assembled yet for the formal ceremony. Number 2, today, of course, we know there's a Rav. The Rav is Mesader Kiddushin. Where does that come from? Clearly nowhere in Shas. In Shas, it's between 2 people. So that's also one of the takanas. There's a takana that has to be the Rav, or the Chazan HaKol, the Ramuni HaKol. There has to be some authority who's standing and overseeing. That's also a response to this, a Chiddush. Number 3, the family should be there. The family should be present. These are all things we take for granted today, but if you learn the Gemara, you notice that there's absolutely no reference to any of this. This is all building in reaction, he says. Of course, it could be that the ceremonies for marriage were taking shape regardless for social reasons, but for halachic reasons, for communal reasons, for socio-halachic reasons, these are all very important guardrails being put in place to prevent more situations in which Kiddushin can lead to a problem. Another takana is to have documentation. There should be a ksuba, there should be a shtar erison. It should be documented that when you do it properly. And of course, the thing we mentioned already, essentially, which is to not do Kiddushin in advance. So that's a major part of that as well. And in some locales, they also mention that you should have a talk with the Mekadesh, have a talk with the groom, and find out whether, who is he, where is he coming from, what's his story. So a lot of what we take for granted today started to take shape during this period in response to these problems. And then he mentions the methods of enforcement, so cherem, nidur, different locations, or knas. In one location, there was even pain of threat of arrest. They could detain someone if they felt that he did Kiddushin and he shouldn't have. It could be malchus in some places. They had whippings, lashings. And then he goes off into Hafkas HaKiddushin. As we know today, Hafkas Kiddushin is a very, very, very controversial topic, and he already had an eye on this topic, writing about this in 1945. Of course, we know that Hafkas Kiddushin controversies in the modern era began even before 1945. So the way he summarizes it is that there was a discussion about this in the era of the Rishonim, and the question of whether we can use Hafkas Kiddushin in a broader, freer way whenever we feel it's appropriate, or whether it's only used in very specific, narrow cases. This was a discussion taking place in the era of the Rishonim, and the way he described it is not simply a theoretical, Talmudic theoretical discussion, but in a sense in response to these questions, in a practical question of application. Can we use Hafkas Kiddushin as a solution for these many problems that tend to crop up or not? And he says there were Gaonei Bavel who said very clearly that Chachamim meant that Taka, every generation, Chachamim have the power Lafkia Kiddushin. He says the Chachmei Vermaiza, the Chachmei of Spira, in the days of the Ravan and the Ramban and the Rosh were all of this view, and obviously there are others of another view, and that's somewhat of where this discussion originates. At any rate, that's what happens during that first Tkufa. Jumping now to his second Tkufa, which as we said is between Girush Sfarad and Gzeres Tach. So he says that was also a very rich period with a lot of development taking place during this time. So of course, the minhag to merge the Kiddushin with the Chuppah ceremony spreads to the south and spreads to the east, and Shidduchen takes over and replaces Erusin basically everywhere, almost everywhere, to the extent that there's a certain confusion, which some might be familiar with even from today. He quotes Tshuva where the Paisik writes, "D'b'lashoim b'nei Adam kaidin l'meshudechas arusa." Right, so I believe we know that the Rebbe was ma'ir, taka, not to use the words interchangeably, because I think in modern Hebrew they sort of carried over the old term of erusin, ma'uras, ma'ureset. It's sort of the standard words in modern Hebrew to refer to an engagement without weighing in one way or the other on whether there are Kiddushin or not. They just, as modern Hebrew sometimes tends to do, it takes an old word and gives it somewhat new meaning, changes the meaning a bit. So in modern Hebrew, those are the terms. A lot of from people, I believe, do use the terms and don't think much of it. I believe the Rebbe was ma'ir taken not to use it because there's that association, the chashash. Why mention any word that has that conjures up the association of Kiddushin? That's just in today's musagim. But back then, it was a bigger issue. It was and sometimes that created literal questions. Maybe the Rebbe was referencing these shuvas many hundreds of years ago when they heard that someone was an arusa. Wait a second, is she an arusa because that's just the word we use, a borrowed term, or are we saying that there actually were Kiddushin? And he's been signed to a number of shuvas that discuss this. Another thing he says was discussed then was the chashash of sivloinus. We know the chassan and kal, when they're engaged, they exchange gifts. We know the Rebbe also said to be nizer when it comes to the gifts, maybe that the chassan shouldn't give it directly into the kal's hand, something like that, which also corresponds to this earlier chashash that sivloinus itself, exchanging gifts, could be seen perhaps as a form of kiddushin, and that would mean that every shidduch is automatically kiddushin. And he says that they made special takanas, without getting into the details, where sort of they got around the problem. They put the problem of savlainus away. That's not something we have to be concerned about. So obviously, it is okay to exchange gifts, like the Rebbe said, maybe trying to avoid giving it directly, so there's no concern like that. But of course, the issues that we described earlier, the fact that you have these cases where someone does Kiddushin when he shouldn't have and creates a problem, those never really go away. All the takanas that we were talking about are meant to minimize the likelihood of it happening, but if a boy gives a girl a ring and says Harei Mekudeshes, it still creates problems till today. Nothing can really change that. It's just how much social pressure can you create against, denormalizing it, making it almost out of the question, and so that keeps on developing. There are a lot of questions, a lot of shiurs, a lot of problems when things do go wrong, and a lot of takanas that are aiming and targeting this problem. And he says you see this happening concurrently, literally across the globe. You see it in North Africa, you see it in Syria, you see it in Poland and Litva, you see it all over the place. And again, many of the same themes. Kiddushin should take place in front of 10 Yidden. And in some places they emphasize it has to be 10 adults, can't be 10 children. Obviously, this is not going to passel the Kiddushin if you don't do it, but it's just really, really pushing people not to do it the wrong way. Again, the warning, really, not just that when you do it correctly, that you should do the Kiddushin with a chuppah, but a warning not to be Mekadesh, not b'shas the chuppah. And you see this in Takanas of Krukka, and the Takanas of Litta, Takanas Vada Abaratzis. They keep on coming back to this and emphasizing, reinforcing. And again, supervision. It should be the Rosh of the Beis Din, or the Chacham, or the Dayan, or the Rosh Hashiva, or the Chazan HaKnesset, or whatever the title or the individual is, as well as getting the family more involved. The parents, the relatives should be involved, should be approving of it, should not be happening behind the parents' back, and a few other things like that. And then, of course, he gets back to his big topic of Hafkaras Kiddushin, whether Kiddushin can be revoked or not. And again, he says there were some early Chachamim who held that there could be Hafkaras Kiddushin, they can make a takana to be Mafkia Kiddushin if it violates the rules that have been accepted by the Kehillah. But you also see more and more of other Chachamim saying that we don't want to we don't want to touch this whole Hafkaras Kiddushin thing because of how seriously we take Isser Veishis Ish. And even if in theory maybe it's possible, but it's like really something we don't want to touch. And this is a phenomenon you find in halacha, where the poskim have some internal compass that tells them that this is not the path we want to go down, this is not the tool we want to use, and we're essentially shutting it down. And he has special discussion for Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Mechaber stance on this major question. He points out that in Even Ezer, Siman Chavches, and the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber says, I'm just going to list all the opinions of Rishonim without saying my own opinion. Quotes a number of Mekayros. He also emphasizes that there were important Mekayros that the Beis Yosef did not cite, which can appear to be a bit of an oversight perhaps, meaning what would his opinion have been if he had seen those Mekayros? Always an intriguing question. And then amazingly, in Shulchan Aruch, which summarizes the Torah Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo completely skips this question, he says. It's as if Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted to avoid addressing it. It was still an active question, still an active discussion, and his decision was to address it by not addressing it, by just avoiding it completely. At any rate, the Gedolei Chachmei Ashkenaz at this time, Marshal, Ramah, and Lavush, all tended to be machmir. They took the stance to be machmir on this question, and the rest is history. That's that for the second period. Jumping ahead to his summary of the third period, which we said was from after the Gzeira of Tach V'Tat, so from the second half of the 1600s up until the modern era, you could say. So he says, at this point already, things start quieting down, settling down. There's not as much creativity, creating new exciting discussions and ideas. Things have already been put in place. So a lot of the things we mentioned before are obviously in place now, and Chuppah and Kiddushin are a lot more in line with what we are familiar with today. That's already become the norm. There is still some development in some of the details. He says among the Ashkenazim, the Morad Asra's power over Kiddushin, with which we are somewhat familiar today, really reaches its power and strength during this time. In fact, some places they created the concept of Hataras HaKiddushin. You have to go to the Rav and get a document that permits you to go ahead with your Kiddushin. You don't have a shus to be Mekadesh without the Rav's prior approval. There's also the Isser Hasagas Gvul. This Rav is in charge of the Kiddushin. If he's in charge, that means you can't be Masik Gvul. Perhaps when we discuss about being Masik Gvul in today's context, since we don't necessarily see the Rav as being that powerful over deciding who gets married, so could Taka be the reason why maybe the Isser Hasagas Gvul is also somewhat more disregarded and dismissed in this day and age. Obviously, that's still pretty contentious, especially depending on where you are. But that's where these ideas come from. And we mentioned earlier about the different people being present, but really the concept of a Mesader Kiddushin in the modern sense, that the Rav is there running the show from beginning to end and he runs through all the steps, that really takes form during this period, or at least assumes that form in additional geographic areas. Perhaps in Ashkenaz it had already assumed that form, but in other countries beyond, in the East, etc., the Masad Kiddushin role takes shape there as well. And as for the big topic of Hafkas HaKiddushin, he says at this point it's mostly moot, and the discussion is not very active anymore at all. Obviously, Sfarim still discuss it in a more theoretical sense, and maybe there's a rare instance here and there of a community resorting to it, but it's not really part of the discussion in a practical way. And with that, we conclude his summary of the third period, and now we're ready to get up to the topic we're really here for, which is the fourth period and the question of civil marriage and the history of this halachic discussion. And I guess you can say all of the above was just by way of introduction on our way to arrive at the topic at hand. So, moving along to Freiman's fourth section. So, the truth is really begins by continuing on the same themes of how the Jewish community responded to challenges to performing Kiddushin and Nisuin, but not much of significance happens during this period, I suppose. Of course, this is when he really hits on his pet topic of Hafkas Kiddushin, and he presents it in a way that perhaps we wouldn't agree with 100%, and that's not the focus here, that's not what we're going to get into. But then comes this major discussion of this new challenge of Zivugin Shalei Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, and he divides this into four categories: Christian marriage, Muslim marriage, free-for-all, Zivugin Chafshiyim, Bli Kol Tekes, no ceremony at all, and civil marriage. And some of these issues, of course, actually stretch back and begin long before this fourth period, but he saves his entire presentation of all the aspects of this issue for here. And it's interesting to take a look first at how he summarizes the discussion over Christian marriage, for example. Now, as he points out, civil marriage was a much larger question because any Jew, once civil marriage was introduced, any Jew could potentially marry this way, whereas Christian marriage was not an option available to the Jewish community. If you were within the Jewish community, you had to marry in the Jewish way, and you could only marry in the Christian way if you switched, essentially, and you converted and were baptized. Then there was this discussion of Christian marriage, so all the questions of Christian marriage only apply to Meshumadim. And, of course, the discussion launches with the tshuva of the Rivash that we've seen. Shalos Tshuvas Rivash, some involved. We're not going to repeat that and summarize that again, but that's, of course, the first major discussion. He points out that, in fact, the preceding tshuva in the Rivash, Siman Hey, is also rather similar. In that case, there was some kind of engagement, Eidesen, Shidduchen, but it was done in a Christian way, and he essentially makes the same point that he does not regard Christian Eidesen or Shidduchen, or whatever you want to call it, like he says, he doesn't really regard that as having any significance. There's certainly no Chashash Kiddushin there. Rivash was not the only one during that time and place. The refugees to North Africa from the Gzeiros to discuss this. The Rashbatz discusses this as well. And Rashbatz discusses a different variation of this question. Rivash is talking about people who purely followed the Christian ceremony. Rashbatz discusses Anusim that we're more familiar with from the stories, from the legends, Anusim who are trying to have it both ways. So, they actually were trying to perform Kiddushin. How do they perform Kiddushin? So before they went to do it the Christian way, they would gather, they would get Eidim from the community of Anusim, and to them, these were their fellow Jews, and they would do some kind of Jewish ceremony in private, and then they would go and do a public non-Jewish Christian ceremony. And the question is, what about the Kiddushin here? And he actually argues that, strictly speaking, the Kiddushin with Eidim Anusim shouldn't count as a legitimate Kiddushin, and then the Christian marriage shouldn't count as legitimate Kiddushin either. However, the big difference here is that the person does seem to want to perform Kiddushin. He does seem to have good intentions. Part of the Rivash's argument was that this person clearly does not have any good intentions. He's a parutz, etc., etc. So there's no reason to say that he'd, that somehow living together would be Kiddushin. But in this case, where they do mean well and they are attempting to perform Kiddushin, even if the Kiddushin ceremony didn't work, but perhaps there is a shaila now as to whether the fact they live together would mean that there's a be'ila l'shem kiddushin that could be counted taka al pi halacha. If you look at the full set of Shut Tashbit, so people might be familiar, there are tshuvas there, I think in Chelik Dalad, or whatever, tshuvas from his descendants. So there are a number of generations of this Duran family, or Abanim, in North Africa, that continue dealing with questions relating to this community. So he says, if you look there in Shut Yochanu Bayaz, which is essentially about 100 years later, the Tkufas HaGerosh, you see a mention of the fact that the Anusim were still doing this practice. They were still attempting, to their mind, they were being Mekadesh, Kadas Moshe Yisrael, privately, secretly perhaps, before they got married in the church. So it's before they go to the church, Yaviu, Shnei Yehudim Lebeisam, Ubefneim, Yitin Lahabal Kiddushin, V'yivorchu Lehem Birchas Eidesen, and then they would go and perform the Christian marriage ceremony. However, Spain is not in fact the only place where this was an issue, and there's also a tshuva from the Trumas Hadeshen in the 1400s in Ashkenaz, where he discusses essentially the same question, that there was a Meshumed who, when he lived as a guy, married a Bas Yisrael who was also Meshumedes, and they were married by the Galach, and they spent 2-3 years together, and then she became from again, Chazur Hila Dasa Emes, and now she looked for a different shidduch. She wanted to have a Yiddish shidduch, and someone else was Makadisher. Now the shaila was, wait a second, she was living with a Yid, a Meshumed. Can she just go and marry a Yid now? Can she just become a Balas Shuva and marry a Yid? The Tumas Hadeshen says, V'hitarti haloi, I was matir, because surely she and that Meshumed, living as Meshumedim, never had this kavanah of Kiddushin, Kedas, Moshe Yisrael. They're stam living together the way Goyim live together. Obviously, they had the sense that they were exclusive to each other, and that's why they went to the Galach to do whatever the Galach does. He says, however, that's not enough to say that there's a real marriage here according to Yiddishkeit, according to Halacha. We're not going to say, when the person was Yotzem and Aklal, B'chol Aveda Shabbatayda, and that Meshumed, he says, anyway, was Paratz Beniyov, even when he was from. So, this idea that the Meshumedim are not exactly the cream of the crop to begin with, even before they became a Meshumed. So we know who this guy is, and there's no reason to think that there's any kashira kavana of Kiddushin here. So the Trumas Hadeshen was making essentially a pretty similar argument, it seems, to the Rivash, and saying that, no, we don't assume in a true fargoyish Meshumed situation where going to the Galach exclusively, there's really certainly no reason to be chayshish and say that there was something there l'shem kiddushin. If she becomes a Baal Shuvah, then she can just go ahead and marry someone Kedas Moshe Yisrael. The next historical period when this became a discussion is actually not that much later. It says towards the end of the 1400s, there was, I would say, a little-known shmad in South Italy. Jews in South Italy were forced to convert. We're familiar with South Italy. We know Calabria. Earlier this year in a different shiur, spoke about different regions of Italy and the Yisregim, but this has nothing to do with that. But this is in South Italy. There was a shmad, and this created questions of a very similar nature. And again, you had couples where they had only gotten married in the Christian manner. So he quotes a tshuva of Rabbi Dovid HaKohen, the Radach of Corfu. He quotes another tshuva of Rabbi Binyamin Zev, Shut Binyamin Zev, who I believe lived in Greek territory, but not far, and Jews from South Italy had ended up in that community where Binyamin Zev was a Paisek. We know Binyamin Zev is his own topic, is his own sugya. There's a historical controversy over his shalos and shuvas. There was a historical controversy over him, his own psak in his lifetime, and it's carried over. There are certain achreinim that when they see mention of his sefer, they'll react negatively, and that's really its own interesting discussion. But Lamaisa, he was writing psakim at the time, and he's part of the discussion of the time. And Rabbi Binyamin Zev discussed a case in which there was a woman who was married to a real Meshumed there in South Italy, and then at some point, all the Jews were expelled, not only the Jews, but even the Mishumadim were expelled, and they all were spit out and landed in his community in the Greek lands, the Greek islands. And this Meshumad, Geblieben HaMeshumad, even when he seemingly had no reason compelling him to remain one, but Yiddishkeit was not for him. But the woman was more interested. She returned, became a Baal Shuvah, returned to Das Yisrael, and she, once again, like in this case as well, she wanted to marry a Jewish husband, Kedas Moshe Yisrael. And now the question is, does she need a get? And at this point, we're already further along in the process, and Rabbi Yamin Zev is able to cite the Trumas Hadeshen as precedent and say that, similarly in this case, we should assume that she is not an Eishes Ish and she could marry whoever she'd like. So around this time, the Mabit has a big tshuva about the Yerusha of the family of Dona Grazia, which sounds like its own fascinating historical chapter. Who knows, perhaps for another time, but in Shut Av Kasarech Siman Pei, there's this tshuva of the Mabit, and in the process, he has to address these marriages between the Anusim, and he makes this point again. The context there is just that these marriages don't count for anything. And he says, "Hachalaka Kiddushin Klal, the Kiddushin Psulun Havu, Mashanoisin Lahem Hakeimer Tabas." The Galach is giving them the ring. There's no ritual that could even be compared to Kiddushin, which was one of the points the Rivash had already made. And in this case, he quotes the Rivash. He cites the Rivash as precedent. It seems that in the 1500s, the church actually changed the ceremony a bit. And there's a tshuva of Yitzhak Gershon, who was a Talmud of Moshe Alshich. This is a tshuva appears in the Shut Maharit Sahalon, and he writes that now there's even less of a ritual, even less of a ceremony when they go through the Christian channels, when they do it in the Christian manner. The Galach says, you should know that now you are married according to Sidia Romana. You're married according to, and this is apparently a Latin term, which means roughly that it's being done in accordance with papal law. And the significance of this, he says, is that now there's even less than there was in the time of the Rivash. In the time of the Rivash, the Galach did something, and now the Galach doesn't even do anything. There's no physical interaction between the parties. It just says, Dvorim Ba'alma. The Galach says, you are now married, you are now husband and wife. The Enkan Reach Kiddushin Klal. There isn't even the slightest trace of Kiddushin here. One additional wrinkle to this whole parsha is that Anusim, who were aware that they weren't really married, Kedas Moshe Yisrael, having gotten married under the conditions that they lived in. Once they left, around this time you had a big community of Anusim, of ex-Anusim that would leave and return to Yiddishkeit, and there are a number of unique communities like this in different places. So one of the things that would end up happening was somewhat similar to what we're familiar with today with people who emerged from the Soviet Union and the like. They would then conduct a Yiddish chuppah for people many, many years after they had actually moved in and lived together. They would actually do a proper chuppah. And interestingly, apparently they would actually bring their children who had already been born from their union, they would bring them under the chuppah so that they're all part of this Yiddish, like we're all getting married legitimately and you are our legitimate children. And this apparently comes up in a Shaila and a Tshuva of Rav Moshe ben Vinisti in Turkey in the 1600s, where there was a case of Anusim who had emerged, who had left Spain and arrived in Livorno in Italy, and they had lived there for a bit, and then the husband died, and then she apparently went and married his brother, and the shaila was, wait a second, wait, now they left Spain. So if so, now it's not so pasha. Even if you say that back in Spain they followed the Chukas Hagoyim, and there was no Kiddushin, but once the Anusim leave Spain, their whole mindset changes, and now bo lachzis tachas kamfei ashchina, they're doing tshuva. So if they're still living together as husband and wife, now there's a lot more reason to think that there's Kiddushin on their mind. And having lived together, we might say that now there is Kiddushin here. So he was talking more machmer in this situation. Freiman concludes this section of the discussion by pointing out that these halachas, these makaidas, the Rivash, is cited la'alach in Shulchan Aruch. The Chalkas Yaakov that we discussed last time was alluding to this when he says that the Ragad Shavar is going up against the Shulchan Aruch that paskins like the Rivash. So this is in Ibn Ezra Simon Kuf Mem Tes. The Mechaber writes, Ish ve'isha shehamidu le'vedazor ba'enes hagzeides. I think I asked once in a shiur, how many times are Anusim mentioned explicitly in Shulchan Aruch. Maybe that came up in the context of Chashad L'gavi Kashrus. So this is one of the places. Ish ve'isha she'emidu le'veizoda ba'enas ha'gzeidas v'nisses elazah b'chukas hagayim. So afal pishim esyachtem zem zeh b'chol yom eni hakoil ein chosheshin lahem mishum Kiddushin. So the Beis Yosef cited the Rivash l'halacha, and Levush adds some of the Svarar, as we know the Levush does, that they didn't have this kavanah of Kiddushin, fakert. And the Rama also cites this again earlier in Even Ezer in Simon Chavav, that if a Mishum marries a Mishumadas, V'nizgairu, which is the term that Ashkenazim used when Mishumadim came back, Ein kan chashash Kiddushin klal, imutaris latzeis menu b'lei get. So this was cited l'halacha. But he points out that the Nesa Kalim Taka mentioned that, wait, just like we saw earlier in some of these discussions, that it might depend on what the mindset of these Anusim was. If the Anusim were trying to keep Yiddishkeit and were trying to perform Kiddushin, then maybe even if the Kiddushin wasn't good Kiddushin, but maybe there's a lot more reason to say that, Adam Ayisa Bilasa Bilas Nos, and that was Kiddushin. So this ties together the different Nakudas, different points that we've seen in this discussion. The next section in his discussion, as you mentioned, is marriage according to Islamic law. Now, as he points out, there's a big difference here in that it's not a purely religious ceremony. It's actually essentially just the Islamic version, lahavdil of halacha. So it's a bit of a kinyan, and it's a kind of thing that Islamic courts of law would allow anybody, even someone who's not a Muslim, to perform according to their halacha, lahavdil, their sharia. So any Jew in theory who just didn't want to do a Jewish religious wedding could potentially show up there. Doing this did not indicate that a person was a meshumid to Islam. However, of course, doing so would still be considered a pretty major breach of halacha. You have to be a Rosh in the eyes of the Frima Yidden to do this. And he says, in fact, Rabbi Rambam was actually asked already about Jews, or in this case, apparently they were Mishumadim, to Islam, who had gotten married with B'dinei Agam. And apparently Rabbi Rambam had already paskened essentially similarly that it should not count as Kiddushin. We're not going to go through all the material that he has on this topic. It's a bit more obscure, and doesn't necessarily touch directly on the point we're heading to, which is the civil marriage, especially in Europe. I'll just mention one interesting shaila he mentions, that we mentioned that the Tashbetz, the Rashbats, had descendants who were also Rabbanim in that line, that family. And he mentions, in fact, that in Shut Yochnu Bayaz, there's a shaila that Rav Shimon Duran dealt with. And the shaila was as follows: a woman who belonged to a Jewish Arabian tent-dwelling tribe was married to one of the members of that tribe according to their nimusim, according to the way they do things. And how do they do things? The man takes the head covering from the woman's head, he takes it off, he picks it up, and then they say, aha, now she's mu'arasas. That was what passed for a kinyan in this particular milieu based on whatever influences they had that shaped their conduct and the way they behaved. So this had taken place in a particular instance, and then the woman fled, and now the shaila was whether she is an Eishes Ish as a result of this. And Shimon Duran responded that whatever they're doing is clearly not based on halacha, it's based on Nimusei Agoyim, Chukei Seyam, so that would not be considered Kiddushin. There was no Nesina of Kasef and Shava Kasef, and we're not just going to rely on the Yichud, because as we know, that once you don't have the right Kavana L'Shem Kiddushin, and you're following Chukas Hagayim, so this Yisoid of the Rivash, that we're not going to now inject thoughts of Kiddushin into your mindset. He says that the Shimon's son, Reb Tzemach, adds in a Haggah that based on this tshuva, Itaka were matir. Apparently there was an entire Shevet at this point that had descended from this woman alone, if I'm understanding correctly, and there was a particular group at this point with a certain name, and the shaila was whether they can ba bakahol or not, and the conclusion was that even though this woman originally had run away from her first husband, but based on this tshuva was determined that this didn't count for anything, and she had been entitled to marry someone else without receiving a get. So just a fascinating interaction here between these Spanish expats who had landed in North Africa, who in a certain measure were a hemshech of that Spanish European tradition, interacting with these unique shilas that arose apparently among the more Arabian Jewish tribes that were more native to these lands of North Africa. Very, very interesting. Like I said before, we're not going to go through the rest of the material concerning shilas that come up in halacha relating to Islamic marriage, but we'll just skip to his summary of this section, which is that once again it seems like most poskim, when asked these types of questions, tended to say the similar point, that we're not going to count Islamic marriage as Kiddushin, as Nisuin, Kedas Meisha B'Yisrael. The next section here is what he called Zivugin Chafshiyim, so cohabitation without any particular legal, religious marriage framework. And of course, this is something that we're actually very familiar with today as well. The Torah has something called a pilegesh. The word pilegesh itself, I think, morphs in meaning over time. The truth really is, I think, as we see that even institutions like marriage morph over time, as we saw the history of Kiddushin and Nisuin, and the way it's done, but also the meaning of the union and the legal significance, the social significance, even when you have the same word, but often the meaning and significance can change and morph over time. So you have this word pilegesh. The context of the Torah has a very specific meaning within, I guess, perhaps a more tribal setup. A wealthier individual will have multiple wives, as we know, polygamy, which is its own discussion, something I spoke about earlier this year. But in addition to polygamy, you would have someone more like a king, would have his main wives, and then the pilagshim on the side. Moving beyond that context, over time you have the concept of a mistress, where someone's married primarily to one wife, but has someone else on the side. And then, of course, you have what's called today, boyfriend, girlfriend, where they might be exclusive to each other, but it's still falling short of making it official. And that's essentially what this section is about, different variations on this concept of people living together, but there's no Kiddushin and there's no marriage of any kind. And the question here will be, can we say that there was Kiddushin? Can we say, obviously, we already learned from the Rivash that the psak halacha that he was going with was that people that act in oifen of prutzim, when you're dealing with people like that, there's less of a reason to think that they're machavin l'shem kiddushin. We wouldn't attribute that kind of kavanah to these types of people. But really, the question of the pilegesh is a discussion in Yeshayim and Achreinim in its own right. Obviously, there's a related question, whether Torah is even matir for the average person to have a pilegesh in whichever sense we're talking about. And there are some Rishonim that may have said yes, that we're not getting into that at all. But the discussion indicates that this was a question. He quotes that Seydel Adarach as saying, Shirabu aloichem pilagshim ba'eretz hazois. And of course, that could be a different question, because a person might be intending to mekayim the inyan of pilegesh in the Torah, in which case the person doing it might even think he's supposed to do Kiddushin. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not what he's talking about. We're talking about people who are intending to live together, perhaps short-term, perhaps long-term, but outside the framework of marriage. And then the question is, how does Yiddishkeit feel about that? And are we going to attribute Kiddushin here or not? And apparently, as it turns out, it seems that situations like this were more common in the distant past than you may have expected. Now, I'm not going to go through all the material here either, but I'll quote selected examples that he mentions. The first one, we return once again to the family of the Rashbats. The Rashbats is descendant, Reb Tzemach, the son of the Rashbash. Again, Shut Yachon Ubayaz. He discusses a scenario in which a Yid came to North Africa from Portugal, and he brought along this woman who wasn't Jewish, and she was Nisgayer in North Africa, and they were just living together without Kiddushin, without a ksuba, and then he ran off and left her behind, and now does she need a get? What's the situation? And Reb Tzemach says, I don't think there was ishus, there was no kinyan here, even though they lived together and were together, but that's not a kinyan, and there's no yichud here with Edom. He didn't say that Mekudesh would be a zoo. So that was his argument in that case, but it's just interesting also to see the kind of situations that were taking place already back then. Tumas Hadashan in Ashkenaz also has a question. We're not going to get into all the details, but he also makes the point that Stam Azay to say that Psabiyah is L'Shem Kiddushin, the Atabdei Seinu Ene Matzi Klal. Skipping ahead to the Chavis Yar in the late 1600s, he describes a woman showed up in a certain community, and she was dressed like a married Yiddish woman, and she was in the company of this man, and they were acting like husband and wife. And the host who was hosting them believed them and gave them a room together. I think in one of the stories involving the Baal Shem Tov, I don't know if it's an Emesamais, it's Sinisht, it might be one of the Shpol Zayda stories, but I think there's this prat where in the story they say that there was a certain Machnas Aruch who was very makbid that if a husband and wife, a man and woman showed up together on the road in Europe, in Eastern Europe 250 years ago, he did not believe that they were actually married, and he would insist that they had to sleep in separate rooms. So apparently, just from that story itself, you get a bit of a sense as to the kind of things that might have been happening when you just had random people wandering together from place to place. At any rate, in this situation, the host, did trust and did give them a room, but then someone showed up from Hamburg and said, wait a second, I know who she is, this story doesn't add up, and she admitted that she was just on the road, or at least this guy was on the road, and they bumped into each other, and he offered her various articles of clothing, and she sort of agreed that they will live together and do their thing together, at least for as long as they're on the road on this trip. And to the extent that she was acting as if she was his wife, but they knew that this was, as of now, really more of a short-term thing with him promising, perhaps, that it will turn into a long-term thing. And now at this point, the whole thing was exposed, and he says, Shahaisa hapsula yefefia, ugvira tonis, umaskelas. Apparently she was an attractive catch, regardless of the circumstances in which she had shown up. And people actually wanted to marry her. Now the Shaila was, meanwhile, that other guy, the Blial, had moved along. So this seems like it was somewhat of the nature of the types of things going on with people, itinerant people wandering from place to place. And he had moved on and disappeared. And now the Shaila is, the Chavis Yair says, what's the story with this woman? So part of the Shaila here is, it's a cyclin al chazakas. There's this idea that if you act married and people regard you and know you to be married, then we just accept that chazaka as reality. But he argues that there wasn't enough time, enough here to create that chazaka. But what about Ein Adam Eisa Bilasa Bilas Nus Mistam this Kiddushin? He says Hebazoi Im Kain Kol Zoyna Tzarach Get Me'anoyev. I think we already alluded to this in the Rivash. That of course we've been aware for many hundreds of years, if not thousands, that there are many short-term or one-time encounters between people, and we never held those encounters to the standard of maybe this Kiddushin, maybe need a get from that. So based on the dynamic, based on the nature of this interaction, this connection between these two, he didn't see it being a case where there's a shiur of Kiddushin and she doesn't need a get. Moving along here, another tshuva he quotes, among others, is from the Tzemach Tzedek. I think Rabbi Shuchat was actually discussing this tshuva in a shiur this week in the context of Siman Yud. The Tzemach Tzedek was asked about a man who had a mistress on the side. He was married, he had a family, and he found another woman who was willing to be exclusive to him, but in addition to his real family. And he even had an apartment for her, and he'd go and come there as he pleased, and there was even a daughter born from that relationship. This went on for 10 years, essentially a pilegesh in the sense of a mistress, and now she wants to move on and settle down and have a proper marriage, and the shaila was whether a get was required. And the Tzemach Tzedek gets into this whole sugya, and the Tzemach Tzedek is chayshish lahachmir, that the pilegesh, even without Kiddushin, might require a get. And then the Tzemach Tzedek adds that there's also the social factor is relevant here, because unlike some of these earlier Makaitis in Spain, where different sources seem to say that, there's plenty of people with Pilagshim. It certainly wasn't the case Stamazoi in Eastern Europe. So Bazoi, you can still say that Ein Adam Isa Bilase Bi'ilaz Nus. So it wasn't accepted socially, it wasn't accepted halachically. So for that reason, the Tzemach Tzedek said preferably he should write a get betzina and don't make a big deal about it, and then she can get married. V'mi efshar lifoil azai eini omer b'zeh lo yisur v'lo heter. So that's the Tzemach Tzedek and Even Ezer Chelik Aleph Siman Kuf Lamed Ches. And then as we enter the more modern era, we start seeing many more shilas that resemble scenarios that we have today. B'tzikol Chanan. If Kavna was asked in the year 1876, there was a woman who wanted to marry a soldier, and they moved in immediately in Rostov. They were living together as husband and wife without a chuppah and Kiddushin, and then they figured, hey, let's actually get married. But for whatever reason, at that point you had the Rav Mitam. The government had stopped recognizing the standard regular from Rabbanim. They had the government-appointed Rabbanim, as we know. Sometimes those Rabbanim were more from, sometimes they were less. At any rate, you had to go through the government-sanctioned rabbinic authority. They did not get approved for whatever reason, so they just moved elsewhere and just showed up and pretended that they had been married, and no one had any idea. She even wrote to her father that she'd gotten married properly, and then at some point, I guess perhaps, some might say, as expected, considering the lack of a proper framework, ultimately the man ran off, and she returned home. And at this point, she was pregnant, and she had a son. And now the shaila was, what do we say here? And B'tzikol Chanan said that we have to investigate if there was a chazaka, that chazaka factor that the Chavis Yira mentioned, that if you live together as husband and wife, if you lie and claim that you're husband and wife for long enough, halacha might recognize that chazaka as powerful enough and that we don't believe you anymore, and then you need a get based on the story you told people. It says Marsham has a shaila, discusses someone where there was a marriage, there was a Kiddushin, but this is, I'm not sure which kingdom, which state this is in, but it sounds like the rabbi was both government appointed and either reform or at least not orthodox enough for the Marsham. And the shaila was, after they had lived together, they had 4 children, and then the husband went completely off and became a meshumid, and then he ended up getting caught up in legal problems, and he got sent to Siberia. So I guess this is within the Russian Empire, and that was the kind of Rav we're talking about, but a very irreligious variety of the government-sanctioned rabbi. And the shaila was, is she an aguna now or not? And the Marsham said he's not makabel at this Rav's Kiddushin as any Kiddushin, and they live together as husband and wife. Says, we can invoke the Rivash. Now when you go and you do the wrong thing, when you don't get married according to Allah, when you go and get married in the church, so that tells us that you don't want Kiddushin. So to the Marsham, this Rav was treif enough that going to this Rav for Kiddushin was like saying, I don't want to have Kiddushin, and even living together, they shouldn't count as Kiddushin. He has additional stories and shuvas here from Rabbi Nezer, from the Divrei Malkiel, from Luvash Mordechai. We don't have time, we can't go through all of them. Then he himself is mitzayin just to a string of shalos and shuvas that are, I guess, for additional homework for those interested, which we're certainly not getting into. He just makes one point at the end that from his perspective and his view, it seems that in early generations, when people were just living together like that, it seems like, in his opinion, no one seemed to be chayshish mishum kedushin and mishum ishus, and as time goes on, it seems like they're being chayshish more. He quotes the Aruch HaShulchan, Ibn Ezra Simchavav, who says, Misha Dorn Pnui Yisraelis Biznus, V'eminim Shekivnu LeKiddushin, M'haya Pam Achas Yichud Be'edim, Meshagoli LaKoil Shemisyachtım Yachad Tzricha Get. So to him, that's heading in a more chumra dika direction. Maybe this is a good time to add a disclaimer that in going through this material, this is purely for getting the historical perspective, purely for understanding how history has shaped how marriage looks, how the shilas relating to marriage look, what the halachic discussion looks like. But this is definitely a lot further away from getting any clear sense of what halacha l'maisa in these situations would be. I wouldn't rely on the presentation in this type of work. If I were to be giving a proper halachic shiur, I wouldn't say you should paskin from the shiurim, but I would definitely put in the effort to ensure that the presentation would come very close to my impression as to what the actual halachic landscape today is. There would be an objective, we'd be trying to get towards a certain maskana. In this particular context, in going through a work like this and presenting the information like this, as it stands right now, you should not assume that you have gotten any true, hard, halachic insight into what the halachas in these situations would be. Perhaps in the course of continuing and fleshing out these themes, we might get to there, we may not, but this is really just for the history and the history of the halacha, and to get the historical perspective as opposed to a true, pure halachic perspective. Now, at long last, we reach the final portion of this discussion, of this overview of Kiddushin and Nisuin, and we finally get to the actual part that was relevant to the topic we began with, which is civil marriage. Right? We were learning Ibn Ezra, Siman Tezayim. We saw the discussion about the Goyim having Eishes Ish or not, and from there we got to the Rosh, who mentions it in the context of his discussion of Yidden getting married Shaloi Kedas Yisrael, and from the Rosh we got to the Chalkas Yaakov, who cited the Rosh in his discussions in the context of civil marriage, and now we've gone through the whole history, back the whole way to the beginning of Seder Kiddushin Nisuin, and all the problems throughout the generations, and now we reach the recent generations and this large problem that arose, which of course ties into the question of Kiddushin as to whether there are Kiddushin in these scenarios. And this section, so Freiman is in his Tkufa Revius, and in the Tkufa Revius, we're in the section on Zivugin Shalei Kedas Moshe Yisrael, and in that section specifically, we are in the fourth part on Nisuin Ezrachim. Now, this subsection is divided into a few subsections of its own. And just to give you a sense of where we're going, he has Hadiyunim Harishonim, the first such discussions that predate when the subject really erupted in earnest. And then he goes through Hungary, Soviet Union, America, and other lands. So let's take a look now at how he summarizes, or how he provides an overview of this topic in halacha. And so, as it turns out, the very first discussion about civil marriage is just a bit earlier than you might have expected. He says, the first country that introduced civil marriage as an option was Holland in the year 1580. Now, the first shaila did not arise that early, but in the year 1741, Tafkov Aleph, which is still earlier than you would expect, we find in the Portuguese community in Amsterdam, there was a publication, pre-Eitz Chaim, one of the first kovitzim, or perhaps they say it's the first kovitz in halacha, a kovitz where people could contribute, conduct discussions among various members of the yeshiva, and I suppose they shared it with the public at large. So, a lot of firsts here. So in this kovitz, pre-Eitz Chaim, from 1741, they published the following question and the following discussion. And the question in short is that Yochanan HaParetz, someone by the name of Yochanan, who was no good, was already married, and he traveled to another city, and he got engaged to another woman. He claimed he was single. They discovered he wasn't. So the Parnasim, who were in charge of Jewish affairs, did not allow him to marry her, to conduct the Jewish marriage. But now there's another option. This is Holland. These are the Netherlands. So he went, and they got married. Bar Koyes Shel Goyim. And the Parnasim, of course, were furious, and they tried to sanction him. But he remained living with her, married to her for a long time, for years, and she was from. She went to the mikveh. Then at some point he regretted these actions, and he abandoned this woman and returned to his original city and returned to his original wife. And now the second woman appeared before the Maimids, before the Jewish leadership, to ask for a shus, for her to be freed, for her to move on, because never were Kiddushin, just the civil marriage and the Rakar Shel Goyim. And according to civil marriage, if they discover that the person was married to someone else previously, so they'll punish him, they'll sanction him, and he has to return to his first wife, and the second one is free to go. That's how their rules work. So she would also like to be free to go, according to Yiddish law as well, and we should give her a shus. And now the shaila is, she's an aguna, what's the story? Do we say that we're Eidi Yichud, and Heinin Eidi Yichud, Heinin Eidi Bia, she's an Eish, or do we say that, no, he was Niskaven to Be'ilas Nus, there is no Be'il Hashem Kiddushin, to Be'ilas Nus, she's not Mekudeshes. So the Bala Tshuva, the Tshuva is signed by Shmuel the Shlema HaKatan. The name comes up as someone who was involved in publishing in Amsterdam at some point, otherwise not necessarily a major brand name. But he wrote this tshuva, and he writes, ideally we should track this guy down, this paritz, this troublemaker down, and get to the bottom of the story, because ultimately it doesn't look right. He says, M'chayar hadavar sheyomiru eishes ish yotza b'loy get. So ideally we would prefer to arrange a get between the two of them, and surely we can get on his case, and he'll agree. Why would he just want to be ma'agin her? However, he says, if for whatever reason we can't track him down, if we can't get to the bottom of it, hadas noita lepoitra. It would seem reasonable to say that she's exempt and let her marry someone else, because, the Meitzah Bilas Nus is only really in the context of a marriage, a proper marriage, and then there's a divorce. We don't just assume this Kiddushin without any context. And why should we be ma'agin her if there was no Kiddushin? It's like a panoya, bala pnuya, any two people that are together. And Dr. Tzu, he mentions Oitam, the fact that he was going against Yiddishkeit, and he invokes the Rivash someone involved. When you go against Yiddishkeit, so that tells you what you need to know. Of course, it's not exactly the same situation here. There were anusim, here not. But this is still, and in fact, the community there had ostracized him. They couldn't put him in chayrim per se, but they kept him at arm's length. And also the same vart of Seifa, look how he behaved in the end. He abandoned her. So that's not the mindset of Kiddushin, that's the mindset of taking advantage of people. So that's the thrust of the response to what may have been the first shaila in history concerning specifically civil marriage. The next stop is Germany in the 1870s with a tshuva from one of the Rabbanim in Hungary at the time, Ram Shik. Earlier I mentioned that I remember that the discussion in Hungary began in the 1870s, but what I'm seeing now, apparently from here, is that the discussion really arrived in Hungary in the 1890s, and it began in Germany in the 1870s when Ram Shik in Hungary was responding to a shaila from Germany. At any rate, 1875 was introduced in Germany, and Ram Shik got a question from Hanover about women who were already getting married through civil marriage without Kiddushin, just with civil documents, and Ram Shik answered according to the straight precedent that the Rama Paskins, that the Mumar and Mumares, they're married according to Gaish law, it's Nus Ba'alma, so who cares if it's this Nimus, if it's that Nimus, Christian, civil. Certainly wouldn't say Eino the Ma'isa Bilas Nus about people like these. He goes as far as saying that even if they were mechavan l'shem Kiddushin, wouldn't be Kiddushin. He concludes, Kach nearly lahalacha, aval l'maisa, if it actually came before me, I would want to think about it a bit more. And he points out that there was another Rav in Tirna at the time who already voiced the concern that maybe we should be machmir. And he argued that the Rivash is talking about mamash galach, and there are no kasher yidden. Masha enkein today, maybe we should look at it differently. And the final, quote-unquote, early source that he mentions, which isn't so early anymore, is the Ridvaz, the Rav Yaakov Dovid Ridvaz, who was in Chicago in 1904. Rav Veltz in Chalkos Yaakov already mentioned this source, so I am not going to repeat it, but he mentions this source here before he moves on to the big discussion in Hungary. So the big discussion in Hungary, as he says, began in the 1890s. It took a few years for the law to pass, but it passed in 1896, and that sparked a really, really large discussion, which I was referencing earlier, and Rav Veltz was citing from as well. So let's take a look, and he divides this into Das Hamatirim and Deos Hamachmirim. The first source he mentions is the Kuntrus Chatei Yasa, which was in fact also cited by Rav Veltz, and the Tshuva of Shalom Kutna, the Rav Eisenstadt, which was cited by Rav Veltz, as well as the Haskama of Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes of Lvov, which was also cited by Rabbi Veltz, so I'm not going to repeat that once again. Another interesting svara says from Arya Kohen Weiss of Chernovitz in Shut Evan Yakara. He says, in addition, the Isha can't be miskadeshes from a bia shel Isser. And in this case, not just Arkayas, they're not Nizr from Isser Nida. Remember, Taka the Rivash also mentioned that as a factor. I don't know if it's quite exactly the way he's using it, but the Rivash did mention that. So they're not being Nizr from Isser Nida, so Bazoi, the ganze bia is nicht kein bia that could be bia for Kiddushin. Now he moves on to the next kuntras. Now this kuntras was mentioned as well by Rabbi Veltz, but he didn't mention who. It said, Rabbi Veltz wrote, Gamba kuntras chikur davar munkach tofish samaches merav godol echad beunganim. I was wondering who it was. I hadn't gotten around to looking it up, but here we see clearly, he says, Moshe Shmuel Glasner, the Rav of Klausenberg, expressed an original opinion in his special kuntras on this topic, chikur davar munkach tofish samaches. And we already mentioned his argument. His argument was that based on everything we know about women today, a woman has to agree to being miskadeshes as well. And everything we know about what they want in marriage and the rights that they want, surely they would not want Kiddushin because that would lock them in halachic marriage, which they would probably want to avoid. So that itself should be a reason to say that she was not mechaven to be miskadeshes, and that should solve this problem and solve the concern. The next source he cites is an interesting one of Shlemitz Vishik of Partzig, the Rashban, as he called himself. I once quoted him in a shiur about Makairis that you are allowed or not allowed to quote, and ironically, he's a mucker that the more Kanoistic communities till today who hail from Hungary would refuse to quote. At any rate, and I believe he was a status quo rabbi, not committed to Orthodox and anti-reform, but yet in this quote in Shut Rashban, he says that Al-Pidin Torah, we have to have total separation from these Rishoyim who are disgracing Torah and are refusing Chuppah and Kiddushin. We have to declare that surely there's no Kedusha according to Yiddishkeit, and Chachamim can come and say that even if you had the Kavanah of Kiddushin, we would still reject it as a Geder and a Siyag, which is an interesting argument. Moving along now to the Deis HaMachmirim. So Veltz mentioned that in the Kuntras Yoshev Mitzaref from the Levushei Mordechai, so he kind of wrote very bekitzer that the Levushei Mordechai had some chashashes, but the Oyel Avram responded and said that there's no tabas, there's no... So who's Oyel Avram, and what did the Yoshev Mitzaref say? So here in this presentation it's a bit clearer. The Oyel Avram is of Avram HaKohen Karpelis, and he said that once civil marriage becomes obligatory, essentially everything has to go through the government offices, regardless of how you get married. So it's harder to say that everyone who goes to court is now dafka going and doing the opposite. They're doing it be'isr, they're going hepech ha'torah. Could be, right, just like here in New York, every from couple that gets married, you have two things you have to do. You have to go get the chuppah and kiddushin, but you also have to go down to the city clerk, to the marriage bureau, and you have to get your marriage license, your marriage certificate. So, right, imagine a scenario in which sometimes people actually go and do the civil marriage first, I believe. I don't think anyone's ever been ma'arer and made a huge deal out of that. You shouldn't go and get civilly married before you get Jewishly married. Maybe there is a basis actually to be sensitive and maybe not to do that. But I believe I've heard it come up in conversation, maybe let's just go get legally married first, and then we'll go get the Chuppah and Kiddushin. Obviously, we're not machshav the legal marriage, it's just a formality. But Avram Karpela says, so what if you had in mind to go do both, and then you just never ended up getting around to the Jewish part? You didn't have the money, you couldn't afford it, something came up, and then maybe over time they even did tshuva, and they were being more mechaven l'shem kiddushin, so the religious state that they were in originally isn't fixed, things can change. And I believe we mentioned that svaras like that did come up even many hundreds of years ago with the Christian marriage, Islamic marriage, that it all really depends on the mindset that they were in. And there was a yisoid, I think, even back then to say that if it looks like they could have meant well, then there's more reason to give them that credit, that benefit of the doubt, and attribute more noble intentions to them, which in this case would cause a problem by saying that maybe they were mechavan l'shem Kiddushin. So because of these arguments, because of the context in which this is taking place now, you can't just go and say, oh, Rishoyim. They're not all Rishoyim. And Abazai, he says you shouldn't just go be Mesader Kiddushin for someone who was previously married through a kois and didn't get a get, and it needs a serious Shilas Chacham. And now comes Levushe Mordechai Winkler, who printed the Yashav Mitzaref and Weizen Tafish Samach. He was also concerned that what if they exchange rings, which is a ceremony you hear about these days. Could that be, and they're talking about marriage, so could that be like discussing Iske Kiddushin, and then he gives her something, and there's also a shtar, there's a contract, and to that, as Rabbi Veltz also quoted, the Oyel Avram Karpos responded that no, there's no tabas and there's no shtar in the civil ceremony. So that, in a nutshell, was the discussion in Hungary, and there was never apparently any major hachra after the law went into effect, although at least you can, judging by Rabbi Veltz, he seemed to summarize his presentation, his summary of the discussion leaned very heavily towards summarizing the matirim. So at least that was his impression, his version of events. We now move along to the next major discussion, which took place in the Soviet Union after the after the beginning of the Soviet Union post-World War I. And here you have millions and millions of Yidden, and they're trapped in this very anti-religious system. And obviously that means that immediately many more Yidden are probably not going to do Chuppah v'Kiddushin, Kiddushin v'Yisrael, as of course we know today with many people who have emerged from the former Soviet Union. And often you hear of ceremonies being conducted many decades after their marriage to finally give them a chuppah and kiddushin, etc. So that's an issue that began immediately. Freiman says they seem to have been unaware that this discussion had ever come up before. The Rabbanim in Russia were not up to date on the latest discussions in Hungary. But you end up seeing the Rabbanim broadly go in the same two directions. So again, starting with the Das HaMatirim, quotes a Rav by the name of Mordechai Dovid Edelberg, a Rav in Nikolaev, in Shut Chazain Lamayid. So he starts by saying that the Pashtos, they're not kshedim, so we wouldn't say, the Maisa Bilasa Bilas Nus, these are Prutzim, Perkeyoel. He says, however, there may be a certain number of women, since this happened so immediately, so suddenly, you may have a large number of women who got married properly, Kedas of Israel, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, decades ago, and now with the new system in place, they may have left their marriages through civil divorce. So if a woman shows up with a civil divorce, you have a chashash, different chashash, which is, how did she get married b'chlal? So if you know they got married with civil marriage, then he doesn't see the problem. But if you don't know how they got married, so now you need to investigate. Another Rav was Rabbi Eliyadim Eliakovsky, who was a Rav in Kharkov. He was asked in 1924. It's printed in Shut Eliyadim. The Rav writing to him wanted to be chayshish, perhaps, that we say, the Meisa Bilas Bilas Nos. And Eliakovsky responded and said that the same argument, the rule applies to kshedim. These are not kshedim, these are prutzim. It's just like the Rivash. There's no chashash of Kiddushin. He does conclude, however, that since this is a question on such a major scale, that we really need Gedolei Yisrael, Gedolei Hadar to all get on board with an approach. The next source is actually from an early issue of the journal, the halachic journal in America, Hapardis. Hapardis was originally printed by Rabbi Pardis from Chicago. It was a Chicago kavitz for many years, and at some point Rabbi Elberg joined, and it said on the Sharblatt on the first page, New York and Chicago. And then at some point, Rabbi Elberg assumed all responsibilities, and then it became a Brooklyn kavitz. But back in 1934, in year Ches, issues number 3 and 4, there was this discussion on this topic concerning the Soviet Union, and there was this Rav Moshe Horowitz who responded to someone who was considering being machmir, and Moshe Horowitz said, I'm taken aback that you'd consider being machmir. What that essentially means, functionally, you're taking a huge chunk of Klal Yisrael and you're putting them in the same category as Karoim. We know you're not allowed to marry, the standard halacha is you're not allowed to marry Karoim because of Echshash Mamzerus, and now you're taking the entire Soviet Jewry and you turn them into Karayim, we're going to be completely severed, disconnected from such a large part of Klal Yisrael. That's terrible. And he goes on to argue and explain that you want to say there's Kiddushin, there has to be a kavanah of Kiddushin. What's the kavanah of Kiddushin? That you want to have the effect, the outcome of Kiddushin Kedas Moshe Yisrael. What is the outcome of that? That she's completely tied to him, and she's ushered every person, all the pratim, all the halachas of marriage, of ishus, according to halacha. And that's all this outlicked when you say that both sides, both parties agree to get married, and that's Moshe Yisrael. He says, look at the people getting married. Is that what they're thinking? Is that their mindset? The mindset is that she's tied to him for the rest of her life, and that she's usher to others. She can always leave. She can leave whenever she wants. She can end the marriage without his agreement. This is a shutfis. This is a partnership. It's a financial partnership between two people. A shutfis built on taiva and on raising children. That's what it is. It's a totally different agreement, a totally different arrangement than what Jewish marriage is all about. And even when they're living together, is the law forbid her from adultery? Not necessarily, etc., etc. So there's certainly no Eino Damaisi Bilasa Bilas Nus here, and there's no problem. Another Rav, Zev Twersky, writing in the Kolel Journal in Yerushalayim, makes an interesting point. He says, the way he sees it, it's the Hashkachas Hashem Yisbarach. Hashem came to save this dirt parrots from Mamzeros. Because we know women will just walk out on their husband. We know women will just opt for civil divorce. So if there was Kiddushin previously, many Mamzerim that would create, etc. Or if after her marriage to her husband, she then goes and marries his brother, one of the Arayas, so weiter, the children will be Mamzerim. But now, because that they're getting married in an oifim where they're not really married, it's just a pilegesh. So there's no chashash mamzeru, she's not an aguna, so in a way, he saw it as Hashem's hand in minimizing problems that could be much, much worse. And we conclude this section, the Matirim, with Reb Chaim Oizer Gradzensky. So that's another mucker that Rabbi Veltz cited. So now we can understand a bit more of the context of these different sources. We saw all the Hungarian sources in their context. And now Reb Chaim Oizer, who's not part of that discussion, he's part of this Soviet Union discussion. And he was asked, and as we cited previously, he said, even Muteres Lakayin, because Poni Habala Pnuya, Loyasa Zaina, that was Reb Chaim Oizer's psak. And now we understand where the Rogachev is coming from. Now we move on to the Kat HaOisrim, and who's the leader of the Kat HaOisrim in this discussion? That is the Rogachev responding to the Metzius in Russia. And he wrote various shuvas. The main one, which we mentioned earlier, was the one in which he said that she needs a get, not mitzad, mamzeros, or anything like that, but he holds as another geder in ishos for davak be'ishtay, as we discussed. There are also other shuvas, apparently, in which he seems to go even further. But as we mentioned, all the way back when, Rogachev was not the only one. And another name that comes up is Rabbi Yehuda Leib Tzirelson of Kishinev. I believe I quoted him once in a shiur, Rabbi Pesach, and in Shut Marchilev, he expressed his view that it doesn't look right. We saw this concern in Holland. It doesn't look right when you have a couple living together, and all of a sudden they just move on. Each one goes their separate ways. It looks like Shalayim, there's a line in Gemara, Shalayim Get, and he invoked the Chashash of Kiddush Bia and the Chashash of Kiddush Shtar. So there were others that also had somewhat of an atiyah l'chumra in this discussion. Freiman then cites a few intermediate views. Of those we will cite Rabbi Yehuda Leib Don Yichya, who I believe I actually mentioned this year in the beginning in the shiur on Esregim, because he had an interesting makar regarding Esregim from different locations. At any rate, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Don Yichya wrote, and he said, who are we talking about over here? We're talking about communists. Communists, B'nei Maflaga Azois, they don't believe in Tenim HaShamayim, they don't believe in Das Moshe Yisrael. Surely they're not having any Kavanah L'Shem Kiddushin. But then he adds, but I have to clarify, because I heard there are some cart-carrying Communist Party members who simply don't have a source of Parnasa, and that's why they are members of the party. But B'seis Salibam, Hey Ma'aminim HaShem B'Teirasai. So these people, maybe they did Kiddushin secretly, or the Mechavan L'Shem Kiddushin, so you would have to investigate who is the husband? Is he taka and ganzen frei, chofshem and apikursim? I don't believe, then you should be matter the isha b'makom even b'ligat. Or are we talking about someone who's just a communist for appearance sake? He does believe in it, but you'd have to tell him B'tzina to also write a get, and no one else should know about it. But he was even a little iffy on his heter for the real hardcore communists, and he ended off with the tzarechiyun, le'isr, le'heter, neita le'heter. That was his stance on the topic. So you see some of that uncertainty or nuance that we saw in Hungary as well, that you can't generalize, you can't just lump everyone together. There are different types of people with different types of intentions. We now get to Freiman's discussion of the debate in America. He mentions that he quoted the Ritbaz earlier, and it's in a different category because by the time the discussion began in earnest in America, it had been long since the Ritbaz, and Ritbaz's stance had been forgotten. Now, the problem here is that Freiman wrote this book in the 40s, and that's kind of still in the middle of the Parsha. Moshe Feinstein hadn't fully arrived on the scene yet, so a discussion of this argument in America with Moshe is a bit lacking. So it's a bit premature to summarize. But he still has some Makaitis. Rav Henkin had already gone on the record. So as the Reisha Matirim, he cites Bavram Aaron Yudelevitz, the Beis Av, who was, of course, Taka, one of the great Rabbanim in America pre our era. And of course, he was also tied to various controversies at the time. We're not going to get into all of that right now. But the Bavram Aaron Yudelevitz, when asked about this, said, of course, you have all this precedent, Rivash, etc. You have the Maram Shik already, who said, Malini Muzeh. Of course, they're not being Mechavim to Yiddishkeit, they're being Mechavim to the opposite. Now you're going to say the general questions, the general concern that some Rabbanim mentioned, that it looks like an Eishes Ish, is mutter la'alma through divorce. Adrabah, he says. If you require a get, that the message that sends everyone is that getting married in court is true marriage according to Yiddishkeit. You don't need Kiddushin. Then he required a get. So in his view, no get for civil marriage in court. Other early American Rabbanim that he quotes are Yaakov ben Sina Kain Mendelssohn of Newark, Yosef Zusmanovich in Slobodka writing to America, and Reb Chaim Fischel Epstein in St. Louis. I'm not going to go through the details of everything they say, but those are some other names. It's just worth mentioning their names and remembering them for a moment. Then he moves on to the Machmirim. So one is Reb Shol Yedid Shochet of Chicago, but the main one for our purposes is Rav Yosef Elia Henkin from New York, and he responded in great detail in Apardis at that time, and he argued very forcefully. But the issue we saw a while back, much earlier, that sometimes there's an issue of chazaka, right? When a couple shows up and they don't disclose that they're not married properly. So there's soiklin ala chazakas, when people are seen living together, they're presumed to be married properly. So he argued that even applies in cases where we know they went to arkos. The chazaka of living together is the chazaka of Eishes Ish. And we're all Eidim. And the fact that there's arkos in the picture doesn't take away from that chazaka. He also argues that since giving a ring is always part of the ceremony, at whichever stage, could be at the engagement, but there's a ring. The groom gives the bride a ring. Here in America, say Bazoi, that should count taka as Kiddushin, and if they gave the ring in front of Eidim, then you need a get. So for this and for other reasons, he concluded, you can't call that a pilegesh, that's a shifcha without zchuyas. Where's the Kiddushin? Moyo miu haksav v'hapirsum shel ishus shabinehem shehabia shel ha'achar kach tigmur ha'ishus shabinehem gam lefi hadin. So he literally constructed this whole framework through which all the details somehow all come together to say that, of course, if you live together as husband and wife, then as haste a husband and wife, and you need a get. As we said, he wrote this in Apardis. He also wrote about it in his Sefer Pirushi Ivra. That is Reb Henkin's famous stance. Now, Freiman does go on for a bit longer, quotes a few other sources in America, then goes on to other countries. We have to wind down here. We've covered more than enough. We certainly got a very important context to understand where a bunch of these Makairis that we were mentioning, Bekitzer, where they all came from, where they all fit in, etc. In conclusion, I just want to mention, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were a number of directions that I could have taken this follow-up in, following up on the previous discussion of the Rivash and then the Rogachover, etc. So I mentioned that there are specific discussions and treatments that elaborate on the Rogachover's ideas. So I just want to mention in a minute or two what some of those discussions are. I'm not saying we're going to continue and follow up now with part 3, but at least just putting it out there that this information, these discussions are there. In Tafshim Mem Vav, there was a journal, Eiraisa, printed in Netanya, and in Eiraisa journal number Tezvav, there's an essay by Rabbi Aaron Shapiro, Rosh Hashiva, Haifa, Netanya, She'elas Nisum Ezrachim B'Tshuvaisav Shel Rogachovi. And he goes through and breaks it down: Kiddushin midin shtar, Kiddushin al yedei bia, Kiddushin midin huchziku, Kiddushin midin pilegesh, Kiddushin midin yud, etc. More sections. He even has a section where he quotes the Rogachover's Shuvas and adds his pianuchim. And speaking of the Rogachover's Shuvas on this topic in pianuchim, so you have Rabbi Mendel Tenenbaum, Lubavitcher, who spent a lot of effort publicizing the Torah of the Rogachover, one of those people that are into editing the Torah of the Rogachover to make it more accessible. And back in Tafshim Mem Ches, not that long after, he printed a special kuntris, Nisuim Ezrachim Mishnasei Shel HaRogachovi Zal, pianuach of 6 chuvas of the Rogachover about Nisuim Ezrachim, and there's this whole kuntris of about 60 pages, and then at the end, he actually has a lumdisha summary, Toichin Ho'inyonim Shel HaRogachovi Ad Kan, where he summarizes the raid of the Rogachover in these 6 chuvas, and some of the inyanim that he elaborated on in his 300 ha'aros. And with that, we conclude for now our very, very lengthy discussion of this vart, this hagdara of the dovak be'ishtoi, which may or may not be the basis for an isser, for being ba on a eishes ish of a benayach, and may or may not be the basis for a category that Rogachover argues exists even when there is just civil marriage.